Excellent. All right. Well, welcome to everyone. I think one or two people are still joining. I wanted to, yes, okay. Just to mention for those, any of you who've not been here before in this group, that the normal format afterwards is after the talk, there's an open period of discussion, questions, comments. Speaking on behalf of this speaker, I can't always guarantee to be able to answer the questions, but I will do my best. And then there's a period of discussion and comments at the end, and we aim to depending on how it goes, finish somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. our time. Right. Sorry. I remember the excitement of looking at a book of James Pollard's Stagecoach Prince, which my father gave me for my birthday as a teenager. I believe that he must have left the price in it by oversight. 4 guineas. Yes, I'm old enough for guineas. They wonderfully evoked that final era in which speed was defined by the swiftness of horses. Here are Pollard's North Country Mails at Peacock, Islington, 1821, and London Farrington Coach passing Buckland House, 1835, both now housed in the Yale Centre of British Art. Charles Dickens was nostalgic of the passing era of the stagecoach travel in his first novel, The Pickwick Papers, published in 1836. In Martin Chuzzlewit, published 7 years later, the London stagecoach rattled noisily through the best streets, defied the cathedral, took the worst corners sharpest, went cutting in everywhere, making everything get out of its way, spun along the open country road, blowing a lively defiance out of its key bugle as its last glad parting legacy. Thus it continued, clinking, jingling, rattling, smoothing on. So in other words, motorists didn't invent the noise on the roads. Looking back in the October 1860 edition of the Cornhill magazine, William MCP Zachary wrote in an article De Juventute which formed part of the series, The Roundabout Papers. The vision has disappeared off the silver. The images of youth and the past are vanishing away. We who lived before railways were made belong to another world. In how many hours could the Prince of Wales, future George IV, drive from Brighton to London with a light carriage built expressly and relays of horses longing to gallop the next stage? He concluded, "We are of the age of steam. We have stepped out of the old world onto Brunel's vast deck and across the waters." Sorry. George Stephenson faced both parliamentary opposition and seemingly impossible natural obstacles in the construction of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which the first ever to link 2 cities, which opened in 1830. The Duke of Wellington had remarked about the new railway engines. "I see no reason to suppose that these machines will force themselves into general use." Yet, as Prime Minister, he was there with many other dignitaries to witness the celebratory run of Robert Stephenson's train, the Rocket, on George Stephenson's new railway. Tragedy struck as William Huskisson was accidentally killed after opening the door to Wellington's carriage. Nevertheless, the Rocket was so successful that virtually all other steam trains were modelled after it. 3 years later, Isambard Kingdom Brunel was appointed as chief engineer for the Great Western Railway, and through a spectacular network of bridges, tunnels, and viaducts, finally linked London to Bristol by 1841. The country was gripped by railway mania. By the 1850s, the whole country was crisscrossed with railway lines, and most major towns and cities in England were connected. John Constable's painting of his beloved Star Valley and Dedham village was completed in 1815. Writing to Archdeacon Fisher in 1821, he looked back nostalgically to his careless childhood and recalled that all that lies on the banks of the Star, they made me a painter, and I am grateful. The actual viewpoint depicted by this particular painting was recently identified after research undertaken on behalf of the National Trust, and is here reproduced by the BBC. The painting is now housed in America at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. His famous painting of the Haywain, which depicted a common scene of rural life, his famous painting of the Haywain depicted a common scene of rural life England in 1821. The actual location depicted was of the mill pond at Flatford on the River Starr. The title, the Haywain, relates to the wooden wagon known as a wain, which was on its way to collect the hay from the adjacent meadow. The painting demonstrates Constable's characteristic accuracy to detail, for which he sketched outdoors, directly from the subject matter. In contrast to the preceding classical tradition, Constable pioneered a realistic trend of landscape painting in what he termed natural painture. The painting is now held by the National Gallery. The gallery was originally housed at 100 Pall Mall from 1824, until a new and much larger building was designed by William Wilkins and constructed between 1832 and 1838. The imposing structure originally accommodated the Royal Academy in its east portico until 1869. The new gallery opened in 1838 and soon came to occupy the north side of Trafalgar Square, when the latter was laid out from 1840 to designs by Charles Barry. John Constable's later work was dominated by nostalgia for the rural life of his youth. He and the radical William Cobbett knew that they were recording a disappearing landscape. Constable through his paintings and Cobbett through his diaries. William Cobbett was described by Karl Marx as the most able representative, or rather the creator, of old English radicalism. Returning to England from political exile in America, he decided to travel extensively and keep a journal of his travels and encounters beginning in 1821 and published under the title of Rural Reads. I'm sorry, what's wrong with me tonight? Rural Rides. I thoroughly recommend it by the way, as a read. Thomas Carlyle, in his essay, The Signs of the Times, 1829, gave his own epithet on the age he was living in. Were we required to characterize this age of ours by any single epithet, we should be tempted to call it not an heroical, devotional, philosophical, or moral age, but above all others, the mechanical age. It is the age of machinery, in every outward and inward sense of that word. Since the middle of the 18th century, Britain had been experiencing the impact of what later historians were to call the Industrial Revolution. Britain led the way to industrialization between 1760 and 1850, while its population more than doubled in the first half of the 19th century. In the late 18th century, agriculture still involved the vast majority of the population. In the opening decades of the 19th century, migration from the countryside to the towns escalated at a sudden and frightening pace. There was considerable alarm at the rate in which the mass movement of people from the countryside occurred. The new and enlarged industrial towns, mainly in the Midlands, where urban populations more than doubled in 30 years. Between the first census of 1801 and that of 1831, by the way, of course, as I just pointed out, the first census was in 1801. So the figures given here by the Illustrated London News for the earlier decades are, to put it mildly, estimated populations, which later historians have considerably questioned. Manchester's population rose from 329,000 to 700,000. Liverpool's from 78,000 to 165,000. Leeds from 94,000 to 183,000. It has been estimated that the population increase between 1800 and 1831 was around 50%, and that between 1831 and 1851, it increased by a further 25%. In Oliver Twist, Dickens described the conditions of a London slum called Jacob's Island. Crazy wooden galleries with holes from which to look upon the slime beneath, windows broken and patched, rooms so small, so filthy, so confined, that the air would seem too tainted even for the dirt and squalor which they shelter. Dirt besmeared walls and decaying foundations. Henry Mayhew's description was very similar. The water of the huge ditch in front of the houses is covered with a scum and prismatic with grease. Along the banks are heaps of indescribable filth. The air has literally the smell of a graveyard. Mayhew's work was later published in a groundbreaking work, London Labour and the London Poor, which revealed in detail the conditions in which these people were forced to live. Zachary reviewed it in Punch in March 1850. A picture of human life so wonderful, so awful, so piteous, so pathetic, so exciting and terrible, that readers of romances own they never read anything like it. But the griefs, struggles, strange adventures here depicted exceed anything that any of us could imagine. Yes, and these wonders and terrors have been lying by your door and mine ever since we had a door of our own. We had but to go 100 yards off and see for ourselves, but we never did. We are of the upper classes. We have had hitherto no community with the poor. We never speak a word to the servant who waits for us for 20 years. Child labor. Industrialization did not create child labor, but the numbers of children in the workforce increased dramatically. Recent research has shown that in the factories and mills, the average age of children was 10, but that is because there were many children who were much younger. Poverty meant that it was more important for a child to bring home a wage than to get an education, and in any case, there was no state provision for free schooling until 1870. In 1821, approximately 49% of the workforce was under 20. In rural areas, children as young as 5 or 6 joined women in agricultural gangs working in fields. Children were cheaper to employ, and there were no enforceable laws to protect them from dangerous working conditions and appallingly long hours, often from dawn to dusk and beyond. Very young children worked extremely long hours and could be severely punished for any mistakes. Large fines were imposed for lateness. Beating was common, as was the accidental loss of limbs in dangerous machinery. Working conditions in these cotton mills were notoriously bad. Early legislation was largely ineffective due to the lack of a means of enforcement. It was only with the Factory Act of 1833 that 4 inspectors were appointed and salaried. The Act prohibited the employment of children younger than 9 years of age and limited the hours that children between 9 and 13 could work. The originator of that legislation was the Tory MP Michael Sadler, but he was defeated in the 1832 election. So that from then on, it was championed by Anthony Ashley Cooper, later 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. He continued to be champion of both the poor and the children and the poor, pushing for protective legislation. On the 4th of August 1840, Lord Ashley said to the House of Commons, "The future hopes of a country must, under God, be laid in the character and condition of its children. However right it may be to attempt, it is almost fruitless to expect the reformation of its adults. As a sapling has been bent, so it will grow. The first step towards a cure is factory legislation. My grand object is to bring these children within the reach of education. Through a series of factory acts, the minimum age for employment in the factories and mills was raised and the hours of work regulated and shortened, so that by 1874, the minimum age was 9. In 1901, it was raised to 12. By then, elementary, primary education was compulsory. Under Shaftesbury's Mines Act of 1842, it became illegal to employ all girls and women underground and boys under 10. 3 years later, Disraeli described graphically the conditions which had existed in the mining community around 1837 in his most famous novel, Sybil. It was the Twilight RVR that announced the cessation of English toil and sends forth the miner and the collier to breathe the air of earth and gaze on the light of heaven. They came forth The mine delivers its gang and the pit its bondsman. The forge is silent and the engine is still. The plain is covered with the swarming multitude. Bands of stalwart men, broad-chested and muscular, wet with toil and black as the children of the tropics. Troops of youth, alas, of both sexes, though neither their raiment nor their language indicates the difference. All are clad in male attire. Naked to the waist, an iron chain fastened to a belt of leather runs between their legs, clad in canvas trousers, which on hands and feet an English girl for 12, sometimes for 16 hours a day, hauls and hurries tubs of coal up subterranean roads, dark, precipitous, and plashy. See too these emerge from the bowels of the earth, infants of 4 and 5 years of age, many of them girls, pretty and still soft and timid, entrusted with the fulfillment of the most responsible duties. Hour after hour elapses, and all that reminds the infant trappers of the world they have quitted, and that which they have joined is the passage of the coal wagons, for which they open the air doors of the galleries, and on keeping which doors constantly closed, except at the moment of passage, the safety of the mine and the lives of the persons employed entirely depend. The Elizabethan poor laws had sought to deal with the mounting problems of poverty and vagrancy. After the dissolution of the monasteries and the religious orders, the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1861 consolidated all the previous legislation into one massive statute. However, with time, it needed amending and adapting through a succession of new laws and schemes, mainly during the 18th century. The parish remained the basic unit for administering poor relief and was held responsible for its own poor. Therefore, the law relied greatly on parochial, unpaid, and non-professional administrators. Parishes were small and their finances were too feeble to cope with the unusually heavy burdens such as those experienced between 1815 and 1821. The cost of poor relief reached new peaks even in relation to increased population. From 1815, post-war political and social unrest, the industrial and agricultural depression, and the increase of unemployment contributed to changing attitudes towards the poor. Furthermore, to the rational mind, there was a real problem with the old poor law, well summarized by the historian Anne Digby. Variety rather than uniformity. I've got this wrong around. Oh no, that's right. Variety rather than uniformity characterized the administration of poor relief in England and Wales, and at no period was this more apparent than the decades before the national reform of the poor laws in 1834. In 1833, Lord Grey, as Prime Minister, set up a Poor Law Commission to examine the workings of the poor law system in Britain. Reverend Chadwick was promoted from Assistant Commissioner to Chief Commissioner and recommended more centralization of the poor law on utilitarian grounds. In their report, published in 1834, the Commission made several recommendations to Parliament. As a result, the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed. I don't have time to go into its details, but the sheer harshness of the new poor law evoked strong and immediate reactions. It seemed monstrous that poverty was to be treated like a crime, and fault placed so squarely on the paupers themselves. In the 1830s, the working classes were without effective trade unions, legal protection, nor any safety net except against the slide into periodic depression and slump. They were also excluded from the vote. The trade depression and fiscal crises of the late 1830s brought real hardship, which was ignored by Melbourne's ineffectual Whig government. The Whig reforms of the 1830s, as we shall see, were institutional, placating the demands of the newly enfranchised upper class, middle classes. There was no attempt to address social or economic issues apart from the infamous New Poor Law. This failure fueled the growth of Chartism, which took its name from its six-point charter. The political agenda of the Chartists should not be taken to mean that it was not also a bread and butter issue. One of their most radical leaders, John Rayner Stevens, commented, "This question of universal suffrage is a knife and fork question, a bread and cheese question." The Chartist leader and MP, Thomas Attwood, presented their 1839 charter to Parliament and summed up the grievances of the working classes. They had seen no attempt to relieve their sufferings, whether they were handloom weavers, artisans, or agricultural laborers, no matter what they might be. Still, there was no relief. In reality, not only were there several causes of Chartism, but those causes varied regionally. The reasons for the ultimate failure of Chartism can be shown by comparison with those which brought about the success in the same period of the AntiCornwall League. The latter's campaign remained focused on its primary objective, the repeal of the 1815 Corn Laws. It was in accord with the spirit of the age and drew its support from the newly enfranchised and their parliamentary representatives. Oh, by the way, could you please, or I forgot to ask this, could you please all mute yourselves? I should have asked that at the beginning. Thank you. And then unmute when we finish. Furthermore, its agitation remained peaceful. Even the demands of the Charter were unrealistic at the time. Universal male suffrage, let's say the vote for every man, was not realized until 1918, while the secret ballot was only granted in 1872, equal constituencies in 1885, the repeal of property qualifications for MPs in 1858, payment of MPs in 1911, and annual parliaments, the sixth point, was regarded as too impractical to ever seriously be contemplated by legislators. The division within Chartism between those who advocated peaceful means, known as moral force, and those who advocated violence, known as physical force, proved to be its undoing, alienating support within the upper and middle classes. As early as 1839, one handbill contained this poem: Let England's sons then prime her guns, and save each good man's daughter. In tyrants' blood baptize your sons, and every villain slaughter. By pike and sword your freedom strive to gain, or make one bloody Moscow of old England's plain. With the renewed prosperity of the end of the 1840s, the movement simply fizzled out. The abolition of slavery. Evangelicalism began to enter the mainstream of the Church of England late in the 18th century. It expressed John Wesley's own concern for social issues and his abhorrence of slavery, most notably in the Clapham sect. This was a group of young clergy and parliamentarians committed to the abolition of the slave trade and led by William Wilberforce, to whom incidentally John Wesley at the very end of his life wrote an impassioned letter against the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration in history. The slavers operated a triangular trade. By the late 18th century, the main route was from the British ports with goods to sell in West Africa. Please mute. Thank you, Nina. Nina, please mute. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Spasiba. They took them to the American colonies, latterly the southern states and the Caribbean, where they were exchanged for sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then sold back to Britain. Thus, the slaves formed a dehumanized cargo for the infamous Middle Passage, where they were crammed and shackled below deck in such appalling conditions that many of them died en route. I'm sorry, this is a bit depressing so far. We'll change a bit later. And many of them died en route. The abolitionists faced a formidable opposition of powerful interests and lobbies. Wilberforce, as an independent MP, continuously introduced bills with impassioned speeches. Defeat after defeat did not deter him until final success in 1807. Thenceforward, the Royal Navy policed the oceans. Between 1808 and 1860, it successfully freed 150,000 Africans, mainly from American slavers. The final abolition of slavery itself had to wait until 1833. The cause was taken up by Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, Thomas Buxton, and Elizabeth Fry, among others, in the intervening years. In the 1820s, there were not only petitions and parliamentary resolutions, but also slave rebellions. Finally, the Reform Act of 1833 weakened the patronage and the lobbying power of the West Indian plantations. Lord Stanley, as colonial secretary, successfully carried the bill for abolition the following year. Wilberforce joyfully received the news on his deathbed. Parliamentary reform. Just one moment. Nearing the end of his essay, The Sign of the Times, Thomas Carlyle had written in 1829, "Meanwhile, that great outward changes are in progress can be doubtful to no one. The thinking minds of all nations call for change. There is a deep-lying struggle in the whole fabric of society, a boundless, grinding collision of the old with the new." That's where the title of this lecture is taken from. The French Revolution, as is now visible enough, was not the parent of this mighty movement, but its offspring. 1830 had proved to be a tumultuous year. In France, King Charles X was overthrown in the July Revolution and replaced by the more moderate and constitutional Louis-Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans. The revolutionary tricolor, re-established by the Marquis de Lafayette, once more flew over Paris. The young John Henry Newman did not dare to leave his hotel on foot for fear of walking under its shadow. The August Revolution in Belgium saw the removal of the Dutch from Belgium and the establishment of a new independent kingdom that would be later ruled over by Queen Victoria's uncle Leopold. In Britain, the swing riots broke out and the reform crisis began as Wellington's government entered its final days. The death of George IV on the 26th of June and his succession by his brother as William IV necessitated a general election. The result weakened Wellington's government and strengthened the reformers. Wellington had needed substantial gains, which did not materialize. Nevertheless, the Iron Duke's speech to the House of Lords, as you can see from here, on the 2nd of November, was intransigent and precipitated the downfall of the Tory government. I'll leave you a moment to just read that for a second. The new Whig government, under the second Earl Grey, whose portrait you saw a little earlier, was committed to parliamentary reform. And their case was a strong one. They claimed that the current reform crisis raised the spectre of revolution. There were also manifestly large levels of what was termed old corruption. The new emerging middle classes constituted a new form of property, as yet unrepresented. The newly industrialized and expanding towns had either no or insufficient parliamentary seats, as compared with many rural ones that returned members. And finally, it was claimed, and the government assured them, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the new reform bill would settle the issue for at least a generation. The new bill, and you can see here on the right, of course, a portrayal of Lord John Russell introducing the first reform bill in 1831. That new bill concentrated on two issues of the redistribution of seats, enfranchisement, rather confusingly termed that, and the extension of the vote. Lord John Russell proposed the bill, as you can see in the House of Commons. The Tory opposition in the Commons was led by Sir Robert Peale. He argued that the checks and balances in the Constitution would be destroyed, as the King would no longer be able to exercise his prerogative over the House of Commons, nor make changes in the ministry. He asked, when you have once established the overpowering influence of the people over this House, what other authority in the state can, nay, what other authority in the state ought to, control its will or reject its decisions? He challenged the government's claim to the bill's finality and warned a government which would unsettle the minds of the people on this subject would be responsible for the consequences that must result. The general election of 1831 resulted in a large majority for reform. The second bill passed the House of Commons in September. It was defeated by 199 votes to 158. The news being greeted by widespread riots in the country, particularly in Bristol, Derby and Nottingham, with some loss of life. Finally, the third bill received the royal assent on the 7th of June, 1822. The first Reform Act set the template for the second and ultimately for the third, in that it encompassed both the redistribution of seats and the extension of the franchise. Furthermore, it required as all electors to register. So when you go and register to vote, or you're supposed to in this country, have to register to vote, you can think back on the 1832 Reform Act, and created an exclusively male electorate for the next 86 years. It hadn't been theoretically exclusively male before that. No. 2 years later, in 1834, the House of Commons was off, please, a second. Thank you. 2 years later, in 1834, the House of Commons and most of the old Palace of Westminster was destroyed by fire. King William IV, Peale and Wellington, yes. The scale of the Tory defeat in the general election to the Reformed Parliament of 1832 was unparalleled until the defeat of John Major's government in 1997. So Robert Peale could only rely on 179 out of 658 MPs. In November 1834, King William IV dismissed Wellington. Dismissed Melbourne and his Whig government. He deferred to Peale. Wellington declined the King's invitation to form a minority government. He deferred to Peale, who was then on holiday. Peale accepted the King's commission. The mainstream of the Whigs met with Daniel O'Connell's Irish Repeal Party at Lichfield House and joined forces to bring down the government after its 100 days. In the election of 1835, Peale gained almost 100 seats. However, this left him and his renamed Conservative Party still with 60 seats short of an overall majority. Peale resigned, and the frustrated William IV had to recall Melbourne. This was to be the last time that a monarch dismissed a government. The new Reform Act had assured that no premier can survive without commanding a majority of the House of Commons. Would you please excuse me for one moment? I will be back. Just 1 second. I'll be back in 1 minute. I do apologize for the break. Please don't go away.
How is everybody? Are you all well?
I didn't want to unmute everybody. I was afraid to do that.
People do that on their own. You don't have to do it.
I know.
We can mute again when Michael comes back.
Right.
Oh, dear.
It's going well.
Well, the good news is we have 23 participants, which is really quite good. Okay, we'll all mute again.
Thank you very much for keeping the troops entertained. And we are in the last, very near the end. So thank you for all staying, and thank you, Lorraine, for providing the intermission entertainment. The Municipal Corporations Act, local government. There was no real system nor uniformity in local government, and indeed the term local government was not yet in use. The Whig government established the Royal Commission, which investigated the corporations, today known as town councils, that administered towns. They discovered that there was diversity in composition and electorates, and these municipal corporations, as well as inefficiency, abuses, corruption, and in the exercise of duties. If you want to hear about certain evidence of my great-grandfather on this, I'll tell you afterwards, great-great-grandfather. There was also a clear need to create more boroughs. The result was the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835. The Act sought to rectify the same kind of issues that the Reform Act had done for parliamentary constituencies. It replaced disorganized and haphazard structures and established uniform practices in the election and composition of these corporations, town councils. While councils were now empowered to make social improvements, they were not compelled, and many took no action at all until the first Public Health Act of 1848. Religion played an important part in the last, I think the last two sections come in, yeah. The monarchy after this, so, yeah. Religion continued to play an important part in British politics. The church-state nexus still embodied the concept of the confessional state until 1828, after which it disintegrated through a series of acts of parliament. In 1828, the government gave in and repealed the laws which formally barred non-Anglican Protestants, known as dissenters, from political office. Now these dissenters had political equality. This only served to highlight the case for granting the same to Roman Catholics. Faced with the spectre of widespread disorder in Ireland, Wellington and George IV capitulated and granted Roman Catholic emancipation in 1829. The Anglican monopoly on power had been broken. There vanished forever the ideal of a confessional state, except in the writings of its latter-day apologists, such as Coleridge in 1830, Thomas Arnold in 1833, and Gladstone in 1838. The enfranchisement of dissenters and their admission to Parliament, together with full Roman Catholic emancipation in 1829, opened the way for the Whig reforms of the 1830s, which further undermined the constitutionally privileged position of the Church of England. The Reform Act of 1832 gave the vote to a much larger body of dissenters. The Duke of Wellington wrote with noticeably characteristic exaggeration on the 6th of March, 1833, "The revolution is made. That is to say, the power is transferred from one class of society, the gentlemen of England, professing the faith of the Church of England, to another class of society, the shopkeepers being dissenters from the Church, many of them Socinians, Unitarians, others atheists. He even went so far as to suggest of the newly franchised, these are all dissenters from the Church. Meanwhile, the Church of England itself faced internal and external problems, which developed into a crisis by the 1830s. Firstly, the Church suffered from a maldistribution of both its human and financial resources. In 1833, Dr. Thomas Arnold, the headmaster of Rugby, from whom most of you know I'm supposed to be writing a book, published the Principles of the Church Reform, in which the future Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford outlined that the history of why the Church of England was facing urgent problems. As the population increased and began to congregate in large masses in those parts of the country which before had been thinly populated, the Church required an enlarged machinery at once flexible and powerful. What she had was both feeble, still, and feeble. The Church of England still maintained the same diocesan map that it had at the end of the reign of Henry VIII. Diocesan and parochial structures mirrored the outdated distribution of seats in the unreformed Parliament of before 1832. In the north of England, there were only 6 vast dioceses. In the south, well, the south was divided into 20 much smaller ones. The same was true at parochial level. The situation was made worse by what were, at the very least, questionable practices. Sorry, I was supposed to show that map of the diocese of Oxford, England. By the way, when I said about the parochial level, rural Norfolk had 731 parishes and Suffolk 510, while Lancashire had only 70 and the West Riding of Oxford 193. In London, there were only available seating in churches known as accommodation for 11% of the population, and in Leeds a mere 5%. The situation was made worse by what were at the time, at the very least, questionable practices: pluralism and absenteeism, sinecures and nepotism. Pluralism meant holding benefices livings of more than one parish and drawing stipends, salaries from them. These were highlighted and exaggerated in the radical John Wade's Extraordinary Black Book of 1830. Melbourne's Whig government responded with a number of reforming acts. In 1836, the established Church Act equalized episcopal incomes of £4,000 a year, except for the senior sees. The Solemnization of Marriages Act the same year introduced civil marriages with licenses being issued in registry offices. This removed one of the dissenters' major grievances. The following year, the legal registration of births, deaths, and marriages, which my history master used to refer to as hatches, matches, and dispatches, passed from the state to the church, from the church to the state, thus removing another of their grievances. The Tithe Act, Commutation Act of 1836, commuted tithes to money payments instead of annual contribution of a fraction of crops and livestock. In 1840, the Ecclesiastical Duties and Revenues Act attempted to deal with sinecures. However, it was Peale's first ministry from 1834 to 1835 that brought about the most remedial measure for the Church of England by establishing the Ecclesiastical Commission, the forerunner of the Church Commission. Thereby, the government placed the internal reform of the Church clearly into the hands of a commission comprised of cabinet ministers, diocesan bishops, and Anglican laymen. It was originally intended to be a temporary royal commission, in Peale's words, for the removal of for the purpose of laying safe foundations, at least of a progressive reform of the church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Hooley, had proposed a modest bill to limit pluralities in 1831, but the ecclesiastical commissioners proposed a more radical solution. Under the Pluralities Act of 1834, no clergyman might have more than 2 benefices, which must be within 10 miles of each other. Now, this is in the wrong order. No, it isn't. Appear to be missing one here. Oh, it suddenly disappeared. I do apologize. Next slide seems to have disappeared. There's supposed to be a slide of Edward, Duke of Kent, Queen Victoria's father, but he seems to have disappeared from here. Let me just check if he's not out of order. No, he isn't out of order. I apologize. He's gone. Queen Victoria only came to the throne in June 1837 because none of her uncles produced a legitimate heir that lived long enough to succeed George IV and William IV, or William IV. The death of George IV's only legitimate daughter, Charlotte, in 1818, while he was still the Prince Regent, left the succession in question for the next generation. The Prince Regent's younger brother, Edward, Duke of Kent, whose picture seems to have gone missing, had to give up his mistress, marry, and very quickly provide an heir. He did so, and Victoria was born on the 24th of May, 1819. George III died the following year, and George IV died without a legitimate heir in 1830, succeeded by his younger brother, William IV, who also had no legitimate heir to survive him, as his four children died in infancy. He stayed alive long enough to see his niece, Princess Alexandrina Victoria, succeed him without a regency less than a month after her 1830. One change took immediate effect, and here he comes, this chap. Her grandfather was restored to his German territories when the Kingdom of Hanover was established at the Congress of Vienna in October 1814. Hanover maintained the Salic law, which barred females from its succession. Victoria was therefore the first British monarch to rule not to rule over Hanover for 123 years, since the Hanoverian succession of 1714. Hanover passed to her uncle Ernest Augustus, now the eldest son and surviving son of George III. I'm very nearly finished. So I notice that people are gradually leaving. The new queen recorded how she received the news of the death of her uncle and her accession in her journal of the 20th of June, 1833-7. I was awoken at 6 o'clock by Mamma, who told me that the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Cunningham were here and wished to see me. I got out of bed and went to into my sitting room, only in my dressing gown, and alone, and saw them. Lord Cunningham then acquainted me that my poor uncle, the king, was no more, and had expired at 12 minutes past 2 this morning, and consequently I am queen. Since it has pleased Providence to place me in this situation, I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young, and perhaps in many, though not in all things, inexperienced. And I am sure that very few have more, real goodwill and more real desire to do good, what is fit and right than I have. Later that morning, the Queen attended her first Privy Council. There is a very marked contrast between the impartiality of our present Queen and the partisanship of her great-great-grandmother. When Victoria was new to the throne, she became very visibly dependent on her Whig Prime Minister, the avuncular Lord Melbourne. The diarist Charles Greville observed, he treats her with unbounded respect. He consults her tastes and wishes and puts her on her ease by his frank and natural manners, while he amuses her with his quaint, queer, epigrammatic turn of mind and his varied knowledge upon all matters. The Queen herself remarked that she loved him like a father. When his government fell in 1839, the young, inexperienced Queen showed a clear partiality in her refusal to accede to the moderate wishes of her Premier, Sir Robert Peale, in his request to replace some of the Whig ladies of the household with Tory ones. I'm on the last page. Lord Melbourne advised her to make some changes, but in her diary, the Queen showed her determination. Lord Melbourne said we might be beat. I said that I never would yield. She wrote to her uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians. You will easily imagine that I firmly resisted this attack on my power. So Robert Peale took seriously his constitutional role as the sovereign's first minister and needed some mark of his confidence. He asked Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, to take over the household, telling him that it was a great responsibility to provide the attendants and companions of this young woman, on whose moral and religious character depends the welfare of millions of human beings. Having failed after 2 interviews with the Queen, Peale asked the Duke of Wellington to intercede. He also failed, as the Queen, still only 19, rather strangely inferred that some actually meant all. Peale sought the opportunity of his courteous resignation speech on the 13th of May to the House of Commons to provide the explanations which I feel it my duty to offer with regard to the circumstances which have induced me to relinquish the attempt to form an administration for the relief of public service. He cited the Queen's letter of the 10th of May. The Queen, having considered the proposal made to her yesterday by Sir Robert Peale to remove the ladies of her bedchamber, cannot consent to adopt a course which she conceives to be contrary to usage and which is repugnant to her feelings. Melbourne resumed office after what became known as the bedchamber crisis. It is only after her marriage to Prince Albert that Victoria began to respect Peale, who won the 1841 general election in the first ever single party government. Let me end by saying something very briefly about Lord Melbourne, both in reality and in the film Young Victoria and the ITV's Victoria. William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, was born on the 15th of March, 1779. So he was already 58 when Victoria became Queen. The portrait by Sir Edward Landseer in the National Portrait Gallery shows him as he was in 1836. In the film Young Victoria, he was far too young and looked too glamorous. And the same mistake was made in the casting of Rufus Sewell in Victoria, although he bore a closer resemblance.